Geography class today, we begin our study in Chapter 10, the Andes and Mid-Latitude countries. The three lessons again are going to cover the physical geography, the history, and the daily life of these countries. You can see that we're wrapping up our study of the continent in South America by completing the last portion of the countries that make up this southern and what would be western portion. Those countries include Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Here's a map of what those countries look like, where they're located. If you need to, refer back to this to make yourself familiar as we are reading about the physical geography of this region in Lesson 1. Click on Lesson 1 or open it in your textbook to go through our reading today. Our essential question is, how does geography influence the way people live? We're going to look at the physical geography of this region and the different countries in this region and look at the diversity from this region because we're covering such a large landscape. If you look back at our map, you can see that we're way up here near the tropical north where we just studied those tropical countries, and we're way down here near almost the South Pole or Antarctica in this southern portion of South America. So there's a large diversity in terms of its distance from the equator, and there's also a large diversity because of the altitude. We've got the Andes Mountains that run down this western coast and the Amazon rainforest in this central region. So you're going to have a large amount of diversity in terms of climate, the physical geography, and then how that actually influences the way people live. As we read through our lesson today, we've got our guided reading activity to take care of. In the very first portion of our activity, the directions ask us to use our textbook to provide a definition or description of each of the terms listed below. So as we're reading in this very first portion, you're going to define the Andes Mountains, what is an Altiplano, Pampas, Pantanal, and the Rio de la Plata. Listen carefully for those key terms and then write in the description based on the context from our reading. Let's jump into it, and then we'll come back to double check that we've got all of those items covered. Physical Geography of the Region, Chapter 10, Lesson 1. The Andes. Three countries make up the bulk of the Andean region in South America. They are Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. From north to south, these countries span from the equator to the southern tip of the continent of South America. The physical landscape includes towering mountains, sweeping plains, and significant waterways. The Andes. Here's what they look like from an aerial view. You can see that the mountains are so high and tall that they're snow-capped, yet down in the valleys there's a lot of greenery and a lot more luscious vegetation. On a map of South America, one of the first features you might notice is the system of mountain ranges running parallel to the continent's Pacific coast. These are the Andes, the longest continuous group of mountain ranges in the world and the tallest in the Western Hemisphere. The Andes include high plateaus and high plains with even higher mountain peaks rising above them. The entire series of the Andes mountain range stretches 4,500 miles. The peaks that made up the Andes are not arranged in one neat line. Instead, they form a series of parallel mountain ranges. The parallel ranges are called cordilleras. The rugged terrain of the cordilleras make travel difficult. These ranges isolated human settlement from one another for centuries. In Peru and Bolivia, the two main branches of the Andes border a high plain called the Altiplano. In fact, the Altiplano means high plain in Spanish. About the size of Kentucky, the Altiplano has an elevation of 11,200 feet and 12,800 feet above sea level. The Andes mountain ranges are the result of collisions between tectonic plates. This change of geologic activity comes as no surprise. After all, the Andes are part of the Ring of Fire. All around the rim of the Pacific Ocean, plates are colliding, separating, or sliding past each other. Those forces make earthquakes and volcanic eruptions a part of life throughout much of the Andes. Let's compare the Andes to some of the other mountain ranges that we've studied. The Andes is a 4,500-mile long mountain range stretched from the western coast of South America. They are one of the largest mountain ranges in terms of having the amount of highest peaks. And it dates this in terms of about 160 million years ago. We know that that's not necessarily accurate, but the tectonic plates can be given the credit for the formation of these. They're called the crown jewel of the Andes Mountains is Mount Aconcagua. The Alaskan mountain range, in comparison, has a total of 37 mountain ranges with some of the highest peaks in North America. One of these peaks is Denali, which goes up to 20,000 feet. The Alaskan mountain ranges were formed by a series of plate movements that were, again, dated with the scientific dating, not with actual biblical dating. And the tectonic plates from Asia collided with in pushing up the mountains in this north to south region. So you have the Andes and the Alaskan mountain range kind of formed on this same line around the Ring of Fire in the Pacific Ocean. The Rocky Mountain Range stretched north and south in western North America. They began to form again with the dated 40 million years ago. One theory is that the plates from the west skidded north on the American plate, and the highest Rocky Mountain peak is 14,000 feet, so a little bit less than what you'd see in the Andes and in the Alaskan range. The Appalachians, which is again in the United States, extend north to south through the eastern North America. They are North America's oldest mountains, which again have this dated time period. Powerful upheavals within the Earth's crust form the Appalachians, which have been eroded over time by ice and running water. The highest peak is only 6,684 feet, which is Mount Mitchell in North Carolina. Now, the Andes, again, has this largest chain in terms of its linear length, and it has this unique shape because of the parallel ranges running as cordilleras. Plains and deserts. The Andes run parallel to the Pacific coast but lie 100 miles to 150 miles inland from the coast. The land between the Andes and the coast averages more than 3,500 feet above sea level. In most places, the land rises steeply from the ocean. The area has tall cliffs and almost no areas of coastal plain. In Peru and North Chile, the area between the Pacific and the Andes is a coastal desert. On the Atlantic side of South America, broad plateaus and valleys spread across Uruguay and eastern Argentina. This plain is called the Pampas. Its thick, fertile soils come from the sediment that have eroded from the Andes. The Pampas, like North America's Great Plains, provide land for growing wheat and corn and for grazing cattle. Coastal Peru and Chile are most of southern Argentina have deserts. Wind patterns and cold Peru current and high elevations are the cause of low precipitation. The Atacama Desert in Peru and northern Chile is so arid that in some places no rainfall has ever been recorded. The Patagonia Desert in Argentina lies in the rain shadow of the Andes. You can see the difference between where those desert type areas are and what those rolling pampas lands look like just in the kind of shadow of those mountains. Here's again what that landscape looks like in variation. Again, quite a bit of diversity based on the elevation changes in this overall region. This one here shows a picture of the Atacama Desert and the irrigation that has to happen. So there's water that has to be pumped in for farming to happen, because you can look at this entire landscape and showing that it's completely barren. This is in the Atacama Desert in Peru and in northern Chile, some of the most barren places and most arid places that have extreme drought because of the rain shadow that's created by the Andes Mountains. There has to be water pumped in here for any type of irrigation or any type of agriculture to take place. Waterways. The Paranara, the Paraguay, and the Uruguay rivers combine to create the second largest river system in South America after the Amazon. The river system drains much of the eastern half of South America. This system is especially important to Paraguay because Paraguay is a landlocked country. So here you can see where those rivers come through. The Paraguay River, the Paranara, and the Uruguay River are flowing through this eastern region. Here's another picture that shows where all three of those come together and they form the second largest river system to the Amazon River in this area. This river system provides transportation routes and makes possible the production for hydroelectric power. Along the Paraguay River is the Pantanal, one of the world's largest wetlands. Here's a picture of what that looks like. Massive area that has a diverse ecosystem based on the amount of water that is spread out over this landscape. This area produces a diverse ecosystem of plants and animals. The Paranara Paraguay-Uruguay river system flows into the Rio de la Plata. This river then empties into the Atlantic Ocean on the border of Argentina and Uruguay. The Rio de la Plata meets the ocean in a broad estuary. An estuary is an area where the ocean tide meets a river current. South America has few large lakes. The largest lake in the Andean region is Lake Titicaca. It lies on the border between Bolivia and Peru. Lake Titicaca is on the Altiplano at 12,500 feet above sea level. It is the world's highest lake that is large enough and deep enough to be used by small ships. Here's a map of what that lake looks like. You can see it lies between Bolivia and Peru. Hopefully through your reading you can go back and provide the definitions or descriptions of the Andes, Altiplano, Pampas, Pantanal, and Rio de la Plata. In this second section, we're going to read about the climate diversity. Probably from your understanding of the diversity of the elevation and the landscape from north to south, and with the Andes being such a major influence in this area, you're going to understand that there's climate diversity. Because climate obviously varies based on its location to the equator. It It varies based on elevation and varies based on the physical geography. So there's going to be many different types of climate pockets or climate diversity in this region. The directions for the section say to answer these questions about the climate of the Andean region and the mid-latitude countries of South America. So as we're reading, we're going to answer these questions. Number one, why is the climate in this region so diverse? Kind of gave you a little preview of it, but we're going to look for it specifically in our reading. Number two, what is the relationship between altitude and climate? We've read that before and have learned that before in other parts of the world that we've studied that have mountainous regions. Number three, how are the climates in the mid-latitude countries of South America different from those in the Andean region? So how are some of the climates of the countries that are a little bit lower in terms of latitude versus those that are right in the Andes Mountains different? And number four, what explains the great difference in climate among regions located at the same latitude and in the Andean region? If you're at the same latitude, that means you're the same distance from the equator or from the South Pole. Why would there be a difference in climate if you're receiving the same amount of sunlight throughout the year? Five, what are El Nino and La Nina? Let's come back and answer those after we've gone through our reading in this section. Climate diversity. Climate is a part of the region's physical geography. The varying mountains, plains, and other landforms in the Andean region and mid-latitude countries of South America mean that the region has extremely diverse climate. The effect of altitude. The main factor that determines climate in the Andes is altitude, or height above sea level. The higher the altitude, the cooler the temperatures are. This is true even in the warm tropics. Conditions in the region can range from hot and humid at lower elevations to freezing in the mountain peaks. Farming is a challenge in the rugged Andean region. Farmers have successfully terraced the hillsides to grow crops such as potatoes, barley, and wheat. Visitors to the Andes might find the altitude at the higher elevations hard to handle. Oxygen is thin, and this results in heavy breathing and tiring easily. The region's inhabitants are adapted to the thinner air as the various native species of plants and animals. So the higher you go in elevation, the colder it gets because that air spreads out. The space between those air molecules, it's said to be air is thinner, therefore it doesn't hold that same level of heat capacity. That's why you're going to see at the highest elevation where you've got a low level oxygen supply, and that's where your mountain peaks are going to be covered with snow because it's above that freezing temperature or below that freezing temperature throughout the year. The closer you get to sea level, a lot of times the closer you are or the warmer you are in the overall climate. So 1,000 feet, there's not really any effect. At 10,000 feet, you can experience a shortness of breath. It's a little bit more difficult to do any type of rigorous activity. At 20,000 feet, less than half the oxygen is available at sea level. So when you're breathing, you're only getting half of the oxygen. You have to breathe twice as hard to get that same amount. At the tallest peak of 29,000 or 30,000 feet, you consider this is where it's most difficult for human survival without any type of oxygen supply. Now, there are a lot of mountains that are this tall, but at 30,000 feet is the average height for commercial planes that are flying. And obviously, when you're flying in a plane, they have to pressurize the cabin so they can keep it oxygenized. So you're at a comfort level because of that height in overall altitude. If you go back to our question, it answered number two, what is the relationship between altitude and climate in the region? You'd say the higher the altitude, the cooler the temperatures are. That also answered number one, why is the climate in this region so diverse? The variety of landforms and altitude influence the climate. As we continue. Mid-latitude variety on page 302. Climates of the mid-latitude countries of South America are quite different from the Andean region. These countries enjoy a generally temperate or moderate climate. In Uruguay, for example, there are average daily temperatures in the middle of winter are about a mild 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 54 degrees. In midsummer, the average daily temperatures reach a comfortable 72 to 79. There's no wet or dry season. Rainfall occurs throughout the year. Inland areas, however, are drier than the coast. Argentina is much larger than Uruguay and includes a greater variety of landforms. As you might expect, Argentina's climate is extremely diverse. It varies from subtropical in the northern to tundra in the far south. Northern Argentina has hot, humid summers. Southern Argentina has warm summers and cold winters with heavy snowfall, especially in the mountains. Paraguay presents yet a different climate. Paraguay is a landlocked country, and the climate is generally temperate to subtropical. Strong winds often sweep the pampas in Paraguay because of the country's lack of mountain ranges to serve as wind barriers. So you can see up here, this is where we're talking the Andean region, that all of these countries that are in this mountainous area have climates based on those mountains. As you get to this northern region here, you're closer to the tropics, so this is why you have some of that rainforest type climate or tropical savanna. In the actual mountains, you have the tundra and high altitude climate, and you've got arid desert that comes from the rain shadow that's created from those mountains. As you move down into the southern and central portion of South America, here's where you have what are called the mid-latitude countries, and you can see in this green portion here, the kind of central portion of Central America, the humid and more temperate type of climate. As you go further south, you again have a lot of those varying climates, such as the different types of desert or marine type climate, because you're so close to the ocean, and the lack of variety here of the overall landscape. Climate extremes. Extremes of climate can be experienced in the Andean region without changing latitude. Altitude is all that has to change. The climate changed tremendously in the Andes from the lower to the higher elevations. The Tierra Caliente, or hot land, is the land near sea level. The hot and humid conditions do not change from month to month. In this zone, farmers grow bananas, sugarcane, cacao, rice, and other tropical crops. From 3,000 to 6,000 feet, the air is pleasantly cool. Abundant rainfall helps forests and a great variety of crops grow. This zone is the Tierra Templada, or temperate land. It is the most densely populated area. Here, farmers grow a variety of crops such as corn, coffee, cotton, wheat, and citrus fruits. Higher up, the climate changes. This is the Tierra Fria, or cold land. It extends from 6,000 feet to 10,000 feet. The landscape is a combination of forests and grassy areas. Farmers here grow crops that thrive in cooler temperatures, including potatoes, barley, and wheat. The land at the highest altitude is the Tierra Helada, or frozen land. Here, above 10,000 feet, conditions can be harsh. The winds blow cold and icy, and temperatures fall well below freezing. Vegetation is sparse, and few people live in this zone. To answer those questions, number 3, how are the climates in the mid-latitude countries of South America different from those in the Andean region? Well, we'd understand that in the Andean region, you're dealing with the extreme altitude of those Andean mountains. So the mid-latitude countries have more of a temperate climate. Temperate to moderate climate. Rainfall is evenly distributed throughout the year. So they actually don't even have the different types of seasons that show up. Now, in both of these pictures, you can see the difference between, if you're going straight across one latitude, 1, 2, 3, 4 different types of climate all at the same latitude. And if you draw a horizontal line anywhere, you're probably going to run into multiple color combinations. Because of that diversity in the overall landscape, you have the diversity of climate. That answers number 4. What explains the great difference in climate among regions located at the same latitude? So again, latitude is this overall horizontal line. Latitude is flatitude. You can see the different color combinations as you go across those lines. That's because of the variety of the elevations. Altitude and elevation change create the different climate types. Lastly, we're answering what is El Nino and La Nina. We continue reading. Every few years, changes in wind patterns and ocean currents in the Pacific Ocean cause unusual and extreme weather in some places in South America. One of these events is called El Nino. During El Nino, the climate along the Pacific coast of South America becomes much warmer and wetter than normal. Floods occur in some places, especially along the coast of Peru. El Ninos form when cold winds from the east are weak. Without these cold winds, the central Pacific Ocean grows warmer than usual. More water evaporates and more clouds form. The thick bands of clouds change wind and rain patterns. Some areas receive heavier than normal rains. Other areas, however, have less than normal rainfall. So an El Nino is when the Pacific Ocean in this equator type area becomes overly heated, and that changes the weather patterns that are then going to move to this western region and affect what's going on here in South America. Scientists have found that El Ninos occur every 3 years. They also found that in some years the opposite kind of unusual weather takes place. This event is called La Nina. Winds from the east become strong, cooling more of the Pacific. When this happens, heavy clouds form in the western Pacific. So El Nino is the warming of the Pacific. La Nina is the cooling of the Pacific because those eastern winds. Here along the tropics, you have the wind traveling like this from this west to eastern region. In the northern area and the southern area in those hemispheres, you actually have the opposite. You've got those westerly winds going from west to east. So you've got eastern trade winds going this way and this way in the tropical areas, but here you've got the opposite effects. You have these two different types of weather formations that are influencing, or the Pacific Ocean influencing the weather in this area. In that portion, you're going to simply define what is El Nino and what is La Nina. Make sure you write this down. El Nino and La Nina are unusual weather patterns caused by changes in wind and ocean currents. During El Nino, the climate becomes much warmer and wetter than normal. During La Nina, winds from the east become very strong and cool, and often heavy clouds will form. The last portion, as we study the natural resources, is for you to fill in the different types of resources that are highlighted here. Energy resources go in these 2 blanks. Minerals and metals go into these 6 blanks. And the wildlife resources go into these 4. Each one of these word webs is distinguished by, obviously, the main idea. As we read through this, you're simply filling in those blanks. The natural resources. The Andean and mid-latitude countries are rich in natural resources. Energy sources are especially important. Bolivia holds the 2nd largest reserves of natural gas in South America, trailing behind only Venezuela. Bolivia also has extensive deposits of petroleum. Paraguay's hydroelectric power plants produce nearly all the country's electricity. The governments want to use these resources to develop and strengthen their economies. Minerals and metals. Besides energy resources, the region has a number of mineral resources. Most of the area's mines are in the Andes. Chile leads the world in exports of copper. Tin production is important in Bolivia's economy, and Bolivia and Peru have deposits of silver, lead, and zinc, and Peru has gold. So here you can see in this key the different types of resources that are indicated in the legend or the key here, and then where those show up in the mid-latitude countries and in the Andean region. Notice that all the different types of metals are primarily found in the Andean region because wherever you have mountains, usually you have lots of mining. You also have the energy resources of petroleum and natural gas found in that region as well. Lastly, wildlife. The region's varied geography and climate support a variety of wildlife, including many species of birds and butterflies. The ability of plants and animals to thrive in the region varies with altitude. So at different altitudes, you have different climates. Therefore, you have different types of animals that can survive in those climate types. A group of mammals called camelids is especially important in this region. Camelids are relatives of camels, but they do not have the typical humps of camels. 2 kinds of camelids are the llama and the alpaca, which are shown on page 304. The llama is the larger of the 2. Llamas serve as pack animals and are sources of food, wool, and hides. Native Americans through the Andes tend herds of llamas. These animals are used to carry goods or pull carts. They're also raised for food, hides, and wool. Alpacas are found only in certain parts of Peru and Bolivia. The animal's thick, shaggy coat is an important source of wool. Alpaca wool is strong yet soft and repels water. It is used for all kinds of clothing and an insulation in sleeping bags. Last portion of your assignment is to make sure that as you've read through that natural resource section that you've properly filled in the energy resources, the minerals and metals, and the wildlife. If you need to, pause the video to take a look at the different types of those resources and or reread that section again. Finish up those notes and that guided reading activity, and you're done for the day. God's blessings.